we're looking at it from the perspective of what her ex-husband, Sam Asghari,
Right.
has recently revealed about their relationship and about her conservatorship.
Yeah, this is really fascinating to me because we hear a lot from exes in these big celebrity situations.
Sure.
But he's really coming from a unique place, not just because he was married to her,
Right.
but because of his own background and the unique perspective that brings.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that really drew me to this article from February 13th, 2025.
Okay.
Sam Asghari exposes secrets behind Britney Spears' team.
Interesting.
What was so interesting to me is that Asghari, who immigrated from Iran, actually draws a parallel between what Britney went through
Wow.
and the suppression of women that he witnessed back home.
That's a really powerful comparison when you think about it.
Yeah.
Two completely different cultures on opposite sides of the world,
Right.
And yet he's seeing this common threat of women's autonomy being limited and a lack of control over their own lives.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, we think of America as this place of freedom,
Right.
and yet here's this system
Exactly.
that feels very much at odds with that ideal.
Yeah, and I think the article does a good job of kind of getting into the fact that, he was surprised by this.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, because the article says
Okay.
that Britney's team initially kept the entire conservatorship a secret from Asghari.
Wow.
They didn't tell him about it, and then when they did,
Oh, wow.
it sounds like they really laid down the law. They said, these are the rules, you follow them.
It's almost like they were trying to control her entire world.
It is.
Like every single aspect of it, including who she could even talk to.
It really is chilling when you think about
It
it.
is.
Here's this global superstar,
Right.
and yet behind the scenes, she's got this whole web of control happening.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, Asghari's own experiences growing up in Iran
Yeah.
really deeply affected how he saw this whole thing, because he had witnessed firsthand restrictions placed on women in that society.
Yeah, I think to really understand his reaction,
Uh-huh.
we need to kind of step back for a second and put ourselves in his shoes.
Yes.
The expectations for women in Iranian society are vastly different
Absolutely.
than the American ideal.
Right.
So he's coming at this with a very specific lens.
Right. And the article really doesn't shy away from how troubled he was by this.
Yeah.
He really felt like she was being held back. Her voice was silenced.
Wow.
Her life was completely controlled by this team.
That's a
And she was...
Go ahead.
Or no, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's a really important point to consider.
Yes.
You have this woman who is a global icon. She commands millions of fans.
Right.
And yet in her own life, she's essentially being muted.
It is almost as if the system
Yes.
designed to protect her.
Right. Became a cage. Yeah.
But before we jump too far into that,
Okay.
let's just step back for a minute.
Sure.
And talk about how this system actually works. Because I think a lot of people hear the word conservatorship,
Yeah.
and they don't necessarily understand what it actually means.
Yeah, it's kind of a legal term that most people don't really
Right.
encounter until they're in a situation where it's relevant.
Yeah, so essentially it's when a court appoints someone to manage the affairs of another person
Right.
who is deemed incapable of doing so themselves.
Exactly. And that's really the key here.
Right.
It's about determining someone's capacity to manage their own affairs.
Okay, so it's meant for people who are truly vulnerable and need help.
Right.
But how does that apply to someone like Britney Spears? I mean,
Yeah.
she was a global superstar.
Right.
She was a successful businesswoman.
Well, and that's the thing about conservatorships, right? There are different types, and you can have a conservatorship of the person,
Okay.
which is really focused on like personal decisions, medical decisions, things like that. Or you can have a conservatorship of the estate, which is about the finances.
Got it.
And sometimes people might need both.
Okay, so Britney's case was...
She was under both a conservatorship of the person and the estate.
Wow.
Which means she had very little control over her own life, both personally and financially.
So she couldn't even make decisions about...
It sounds like, from what Asghari's saying,
Yeah.
the level of control was significant.
Okay, so now that we've kind of laid that groundwork and we understand what a conservatorship is,
Right.
let's get back to Asghari's perspective on all of this.
Okay.
What's really interesting is that he seems particularly surprised
Yeah.
that a system like this could exist in the United States,
Yeah.
in a country that really prides itself on freedom and individual rights.
And I think that's a very key point here, because
Yeah.
he comes from a country where there are maybe more overt restrictions on personal freedom.
Sure.
So he probably came to America with this idea
Yeah.
That it's this bastion of individual liberty and,
Right.
something like this couldn't happen here.
Right. He had this very idealized view.
Exactly.
And then he encounters this.
Right, and it challenges that whole perception
Yeah, it really
of
does.
what America is,
Yeah.
what it stands for.
It highlights the tension
It does.
between the ideals of liberty
Yes.
and the reality of the legal system.
And that's what makes this so interesting to me, is that it forces us to confront this, these uncomfortable truths about power and control and the limits of freedom,
Yes.
even in a society that claims to value it above all else.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real paradox.
Yeah, it really is.
And it really, makes you think about the fact that this isn't just about Britney Spears.
Right.
This case really kind of shone a light on a system that affects thousands of people.
It's easy to get caught up in the celebrity of it all,
Right.
but this is about real people's lives.
Exactly. And while conservatorships can be necessary and beneficial in some cases,
Right.
the potential for misuse is a serious concern.
It is, and that brings me back to this point about Britney being silenced.
Yeah,
It sounds like Asghari really felt like
right.
she had no agency, no way to express her own thoughts and desires.
And that's particularly poignant,
Yes.
given who Britney is. She's an artist, she's a performer.
Right.
This is someone whose entire being is about self-expression.
Yeah.
And to have that seemingly stripped away, even if it's for reasons of protection,
Right.
it raises all sorts of questions.
It makes you wonder, what would have happened if she had been given more control?
Well, and that's something we can't know for sure.
Right.
But it does really highlight the need for, careful consideration
Yes.
when implementing these kinds of arrangements.
Absolutely.
How do we ensure that the individual still has a voice?
Right. How do we make sure their wishes are being respected?
Exactly. It's a real balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to protect someone while also respecting their personhood.
Do you think there are ways to improve the system?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of discussions happening right now about reforming conservatorships.
Okay.
And, a lot of advocates are pushing for more oversight, more accountability,
Sure.
greater involvement of the individual.
That makes sense. You can't just assume that because someone needs help in one area of their life,
Right.
that they need to be completely stripped of all decision-making power.
Exactly. And that's why I think Asghari's perspective is so valuable here. He's coming in as an outsider.
Right.
And he's able to see the potential pitfalls of this system
Yeah.
in a way that people who are maybe more familiar with it
Right.
might not.
It's almost like, you need that fresh perspective
Yeah.
to point out the flaws.
Exactly. Sometimes it takes an outsider to say, hey, wait a minute.
Right.
This doesn't seem quite right.
And this article doesn't really go into great detail
Yeah.
about the specific restrictions that Britney faced.
Right.
Do we have any insights from other sources?
We do, actually. There's been a lot of reporting
Okay.
about the level of control she was under.
Okay.
For example, it's been widely reported that she couldn't make major financial decisions.
Wow.
She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't even drive a car without permission.
It's hard to imagine
Yeah.
not even being able to decide where you want to go.
Right. And those are just the more practical things.
Yeah.
There were also reports of limitations on her personal relationships, her social media use,
Wow.
even her medical care.
It's like she was living under house arrest.
It really makes you question the justification for such extreme measures.
It does.
And, while we can't speculate about the specifics of Britney's case,
Right.
it does raise these broader concerns about the potential for overreach. How do we ensure that these arrangements are really in the best interest of the individual?
Right. And not being used as a way to control them.
Exactly. It's a fine line
It is a very fine line.
between protection and oppression.
It really is. So we've talked about Asghari's perspective. We've talked about how conservatorships work
Right.
and about the potential for them to be misused.
Yeah.
But what does this all mean for the average person?
That's a great question.
Why should our listeners care about this?
I think it's because this story really speaks to
Yeah.
this fundamental human desire
Uh-huh.
for autonomy and self-determination.
We all want to have control over our own lives.
Exactly.
And the thought of that being taken away,
Right.
even with good intentions, is unsettling.
It is, and that's why this conversation is so important. It's about raising awareness about this system that can have these huge impacts on people's lives
Right.
and asking these tough questions
Yeah.
about how we balance the need for protection
Right.
with the right to self-determination.
And it's about recognizing that these issues can affect anyone.
Absolutely.
It's not just celebrities.
That could be your neighbor.
It could be your family.
It could be your parents.
Yeah.
We all have a stake in this,
We do.
in making sure that these systems are being used responsibly.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
To transition into the final part of our deep dive, where
Yeah.
we're going to explore some potential solutions
Great.
and takeaways for our listeners. So where do we go from here? We've unpacked a lot about this whole situation.
Yeah.
What are people the takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is awareness.
Yeah.
Asghari really kind of opened up this conversation about the potential for conservatorship abuse and how these systems that are meant to protect
Right.
can sometimes become instruments of control.
It's easy to just assume that everything's working as it should,
Right.
but cases like this really show us
Exactly.
that's not always the case.
Right.
So what can we do? What can we do to make a difference?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to stay informed. Educate yourself about the laws, read up on conservatorships,
Yeah.
understand how they work, what the safeguards are, the potential for abuse.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly.
But what about action? Is there anything we could do to advocate for change?
Absolutely. Support organizations that
Yeah.
are working to reform these systems.
Yeah.
There are groups out there that are really dedicated to advocating for the rights of people under conservatorship, pushing for more oversight,
Right.
more accountability.
And what about on a more personal level?
Yeah.
What if someone we know is in a situation like this?
That's where it becomes even more crucial to
Yeah.
be informed and aware.
Yeah.
If you suspect that someone's being exploited or mistreated, don't be afraid to speak up.
So it's about being vigilant, not just for ourselves,
Exactly.
but for the people around us.
It's about paying attention to the signs and being willing to act.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here,
Yeah.
it's safe to say that Sam Asghari's comments
Uh-huh.
really opened our eyes
They
to
did.
a much bigger issue.
Absolutely. This has gone beyond just celebrity gossip.
Yeah.
This is about power dynamics, individual rights, our responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable.
And it can happen to anyone, anywhere.
Right. It's not just about celebrities. It's about our
Right.
communities. It's about our families. It's
Yeah.
about the people we care about.
Well said. And as we conclude this episode, I want to just leave our listeners with one thought.
Okay.
Don't underestimate the power of your own voice.
That's so important.
By speaking up, by having these conversations,
Yeah.
by supporting organizations dedicated to change.
Absolutely.